we're going to look at the connection between what is lacking in our education system and the connection to our criminal justice system and kids on the street. I'll give you one quick thought, and then we'll just jump right, introduce the panel, we'll jump right into it. One of the guests on my show recently said that we have generations and generations of children, especially black children and black children in this city, who come from generations of families who just never went to school because there was no reason to go. No jobs, no work, dislocated from the rest of the world. We don't know how to teach those kids. We don't bring people in the system who know what those children need, who they are, and that percentage of children fall through the cracks one way or the other. And the question is, what is our education system for, and who's supposed to be educating, and who's supposed to be doing the educating? So let me introduce our panel. Okay, to my right, it's Davon Love. Davon Love is one of the leaders of Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle, and they've been on every one of these panels, and Davon's on this panel. Chris Wilson. Is Chris here? Chris is not here. Okay, so, but Trey Murphy is here. And Trey Murphy is a youth organizer with the Baltimore Algebra Project. He's on the panel, one of the leaders of that organization. Sabrina Joy Stevens, Executive Director of Integrity in Education, is here on the panel. Dr. Natasha Pratt-Harris, who is Associate Professor of Criminal Justice Program Coordinator at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Morgan State University. Good to see you again on the panel. Angela Janice is next to me. She's with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. You run the Mayor's Office, not just with it, you run it. Lab Tech One is with us, hip-hop artist in our community. And if I say, see if I have this, if I have this right, it stands for Life Form Advanced Beyond Terrestrial, I can't read what this says, as esoterics.
My name's Omar. That's easier.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not performing. I'm not doing any art today.
So let's.
It's not an art day.
Okay,
I'm an anthropologist and a historian.
Fine, we'll just do Omar tonight.
Bachelor's in Africana, Master's in African American Studies.
Who's also at Morgan State University and WEA. So let's jump into this thing right away. So many times our city school system becomes a whipping boy for things that are wrong in the entire community. But there's, and that happens a lot. But I'd like to get down to brass tacks with the panel to talk about what it is that's missing, what you think is missing, and then talk about how we repair this. Davon, let me start with you. You came out of the school system. Let me just say a little quick. Davon came out of the public city school system. Davon was part of Boodle, which was the Baltimore Urban Debate Leagues, and which were very popular and powerful in our city school system here in Baltimore. Young people from working class communities who stepped up and became the intellectual leaders of these communities, and has since begun his own programs like Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle. So Davon, go ahead.
Yeah, I think sometimes the conversation about education nationally, but here in Baltimore, I think lacks the historical perspective necessary to really put it in context. If you think about one of the biggest travesties to affect Baltimore and cities around the country is that of integration. A lot of integration was really a bag of worms because what it did was that it undermined the ability for the communities to have control over the institutions that affected their lives. And so what has happened is that as a result, external entities, government agencies, nonprofit organizations have intervened into the inner workings of the black community. And what you find today is the outgrowth, the result of other folks besides us being in control of the institutions that govern our lives. And so that's really important because the criminal justice system, for instance, is an external entity that is not of and from the community, and to think that it has the capacity to properly serve the folks that are most directly affected by something like mass incarceration is just not something that makes any sense, right? And so really the most important thing we can do is invest in the communities that are responsible for caring for the students, for the young people in these communities that are supposed to be served by the education system. And what you'll find is that many of the institutions responsible for doing education policy are folks that aren't of and from the community. A lot of people think because you have, some kind of fancy degree, and that's not to say, I went to college, so it's not to say that we shouldn't seek formal education, but oftentimes it gets mistaken for being qualified to address problems that are systemic. And so many of the folks that are made responsible for our development are folks that are not immersed in the history and culture of our people. And so it becomes a situation where you have people trying to have conversations about addressing the issues facing young people in education that aren't properly trained. And I'll end with this. If I ask the question, what institution, or set of individuals were the most capable at producing world-class scholars and producing people in our communities that were intact, that were safe, that were healthy, what would you say? Some people would say, programs, or would say, colleges. For me, the answer to that question is our grandmothers. Right? They were the proverbial big mama, the people in our communities that really held our communities together and created the context where all the things that people say, because programs are helpful, college education is helpful, but the anchor is to have the community intact so that those institutions can interact with our community, not from the position of the social service model of we need to serve these folks that can't do for themselves, but from a position of building on the strength of our communities. And integration, I think, has had the effect of distorting that context so that we think we got to come up with new things, these completely new methods of teaching young people and addressing the issues facing young people, instead of using the cultural resources of our heritage to fix and repair the issues that our community is effective and equipped to address.
Sabina, let me ask you to pick up on that.
Sure. So I think one of the common feedback there.
Powerful statement already.
Yes. One of the common threads that education shares with a lot of the issues that have already been discussed, whether it's housing, whether it's the criminal justice system, any of a number of these issues, is the transformation of a sector that is supposed to be a public service into a sector that has become a source of private profit. And so when you have a situation where the bottom line is no longer the students, no longer the community, but is now how can we make money off of this? So when we look at the epidemic of school closures happening primarily in Black and brown communities, which is done to make space for development and gentrification, when you look at what you're actually able to do. So I come at this issue as a former teacher, and when you're in a community where you have to worry every day if your school is going to be open, where the teachers who, some of whom, everyone has the best of intentions, some of whom have the knowledge that they need to actually, the cultural competency, et cetera, to teach these children. But the overriding concern has to be test scores, which we know are biased, where there's this constant threat of yourself being out of a job. All of these different things conspire against people actually doing work that serves the needs of the people in front of them. And so we need to look at, again, in all these situations when you're dealing with budget cuts, that's related to the economic situation of privatizing schools in order to make them profitable. Whether you look at the needs of the children who are showing up that are, then distracted from being able to succeed in the classroom because their parents have been laid off or because, their family member just got shot, another family member has been arrested, all these different things, all those issues show up in the classroom, and then you're talking about putting those issues in classrooms that have been set up to fail, that have been set up to look as though they are not doing what they're supposed to do, haven't been given the resources to do those things, precisely so they can be turned into yet another place someone can make money. That is an incredibly insidious thing that undercuts this entire enterprise. And so until we get a handle on understanding that this system is set up to do exactly what it's doing, which is to sort people. For example, if you talk about the economic issues that were just raised on the last panel, you don't have a situation where most people accept that, where they would accept being paid $4, $5, $6, $7 an hour if they didn't walk into a school building or somewhere else where every single day they were being labeled a failure, where they were being told, set up to do things that were not natural to them at an age when it wasn't necessarily natural. All of these different things feed into the problems we see later on, and they're also influenced by the problems that are coming on the outside. So there's so many different things that we need to unpack when we talk about education and public education in particular, but we have to recognize that it is under the same siege as every other issue that we're addressing. And until we understand that, we're not going to be able to really dig into how do we make the school a place where it's actually a place of learning and of healing and of community building, rather than a place of replicating these same exact problems in every successive generation.
So, but before I turn to either Trey or Omar, let me first ask Dr. Natasha Pratt-Harris. I want to make this connection here, this bridge, which is what this panel is partially about. And I forget the exact stat, and I'll get this wrong, someone can correct me because I usually know, but it's gone out of my head. But it's 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 young black men have interaction with the criminal justice system. Now, if you extrapolate out from that and just talk about poverty and class and race, the number is going to be even higher. Even higher. So I don't know, we're going to make this connection between what happens within our schools and the interaction with the criminal justice system and begin to wrestle here with then how do we intervene in that? Natasha?
I'm going to combine, I guess, your initial question and then this one.
Please, go right ahead.
You're talking about what's missing in the first question you asked. And what I see is in the training of a teacher, them being trained to recognize who they're actually going to get in the classroom, what kind of needs they're going to have, how can they actually help to meet the needs of young persons who are coming in the classroom. You mentioned issues of absentee or lateness, why they're in fact late for class. How do teachers, or how can they potentially impact the criminal justice system by way of the communication that they share with students or some of their biases about the students' abilities or inabilities and the like. I had this neat conversation. I'm a product of Baltimore City public school system myself. I had this great conversation this week about some of the success stories of some of my classmates over the past 30 years. And I had this recollection about a teacher telling us that we were the worst 6th grade class in the city of Baltimore. And I remember believing that. I remember thinking, wow, we are the worst 6th grade. We're actually, there's this rating system, and we were placed on that system, and it was acknowledged that we were the worst class. So, and what happens is we can internalize these messages and kind of live what we're being told. So again, I think it's just a matter of teachers actually understanding who they're dealing with. One of the points that I would like to make as it relates to academia and how academia can help to kind of address this issue is for the education curriculum, almost mandating that part of the courses that future teachers are taking is a course on juvenile justice. And them knowing what that system is like and how they're actually contributing to the numbers of young persons who are in the system. In my juvenile justice class, I often talk about, depending upon locale, you have principals, teachers, and others who rely on the police to make decisions in classroom management and that issue. In some areas, the police aren't involved, but the kids are still acting out the same way. Yeah. But there's a disparity in so much as how they're responding. So I think it's important that as a part of teacher training, there's this acknowledgement of who you have in your classroom, how you are in fact impacting what's happening. And ultimately, if it's this whole question of whether or not teachers are actually passionate about the work and acknowledging how they are in fact contributing to the life course of young persons.
Omar, I'll let you jump in.
I just want to say thanks for having me at this wonderful town hall meeting. There were some points I wanted to just cover as quickly as I could just to make sure I didn't leave anything out. When we discuss education, and we're also talking about trying to develop solutions through public policy and community action, this has been said by others during this town hall meeting, but we have to deal with the cyclical outcomes and the historical and systemic oppression that has been enforced on what we now can call, I guess, indigenous black Americans. The results of antebellum and chattel slavery, they are pervasive. And regardless of whether or not there's a consensus of how we address these experiences, economically and socially, they still remain. The thing about the connection between economics and education is when you have systemic inequalities and oppression, it in turn affects education, which in turn affects resources, which in turn affects the ability to develop a self-image, your psychological state, acts of aggression, the valuation of human life. All of these things are a part of the circle. So when we address one thing, specifically my issue with youth, we have to understand that this isn't just the nature of a child, or this isn't just the circumstance of children that don't know better. This is a part of a process. It isn't 100% exclusively the process, there is some free will. People do choose to, do things that are inappropriate. But I think that's a major part of the equation, is understanding the legacy of white privilege, white supremacy, and racism, and how it's affected communities, especially in a predominantly black city like Baltimore. Just cutting to the chase on one of the issues, they had the big deal about the $100 million investment in the juvenile detention. And then now it's, they're talking about doing $70 million in planned state allocations. There was some discussion that the criminalization of youth is big business through the prison industrial complex. So you have now a curfew that will allow youth during the summer to be picked up and put into detention. I read somewhere that Sam Abed, he said the juvenile population was reduced by 50%, but the detention had increased, which is, kind of absurd. And we're talking about 70% nonviolent crimes. So the legacy of economics is very much a big part of it, because there's big money to be made off of the incarceration of youth, as well as black males and black women. And if we're naive, we won't acknowledge the fact that gentrification is a big part of it too. When you have a bunch of kids, I grew up in Baltimore City. I'm a product of Baltimore City. I was an at-risk youth. I didn't have privilege. I was in the system at different times. So I know that when you're trying to gentrify a city, you want the harbor and downtown to be beautiful. But when you have thousands of black youth that don't culturally identify with the people that are tourists, then you have an issue. So you come up with solutions to the problem that you're concerned with, which is revenue for your tourist economy. So I think the real issue is that, when we cut past the obvious systemic issues, I would just cut straight to the chase on some solutions. I'd say that the existing community-based programs should be given public and private assistance through service, as well as philanthropic efforts. You don't have to give money, you can give time. Safe Streets with Brother Hamza is a primary activist organization that deals with direct intervention in violence and homicide, literally dealing with shooters. That program deserves more attention and more coverage and more support. Also, I would say developments of rites of passage in each micro community, not just across the spectrum, but neighborhood by neighborhood, develop these rites of passage with older people, as the brother suggested, the family unit becoming a part of the community, because a lot of these kids don't grow up in the typical nuclear family with mom, dad, and grandma and everybody together. So creating rites of passage where elders can contribute. Public servants should be rigorously trained to function as public servants. They should respect the populations they work for, from elected officials to police, whoever it is, social services, it doesn't matter, teachers, no one is exempt from that. I also believe that the educational paradigm should shift more to an engaged pedagogy, where performance outcomes are measured based on the individuals. Everyone doesn't think the same, so our intelligence can't be measured and quantified in a very narrow rubric. You have to identify what the potential is and allow those people to maximize what they can do with that potential. Also, just in terms of, wrap it up real quick, in terms of how the criminal justice system deals with youth, detention with the juveniles is usually something that they use as a way station until the court date. It's not necessarily designed as punishment. It's not necessarily designed as treatment. It's just a step in the process. That's something that needs to be evaluated from the policy side, and holding these public officials accountable. Greater level of transparency only occurs with the community engagement. And to connect all these dots, this is where I believe the real news can have an impact. It can put a spotlight on some of these different factors, create more accountability, more transparency. Why is it that you want to invest $400 million in, the fence, so that homeless people couldn't sleep? Why is that an issue? Obviously, someone's getting that contract and they're getting paid a lot of money. So these kind of issues, I think, are the circle, not just for the youth, but for the community. And to develop a greater sense of purpose, I think we'll have to implement some of the things that everyone has suggested throughout all these panels, but also take into account the individual accountability, each person. We all have issues, whether we're dealing with the black experience, the non-white experience, if you want to call it that, the white experience. We all have accountability. How much do we answer for our individual selves in context to the collective. And I think that would be a good place to start to develop solutions.
So we're running close out of time for the panel, so you have time for everybody. Maybe one thought, obviously, rather than a discussion. But let me turn to Trey, and then we'll end up with Janice. Okay, Trey.
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, thank you for having me on the panel. I think that I would like to start off with this idea that you get out of a child what you put into them, right? And you get out of people what you put into them. And I'm sure that most of the panelists would agree with me when I say that this is a complex topic, right? Because there are so many different points of view on this idea of education and incarceration. To me, the way that I see it, as some of the panelists eloquently put it, our educational system isn't broken. It's set up to do the very thing that it was supposed to do, which is educate one specific group or race of people. And when integration came about, they did not make the necessary changes or adaptations to ensure that the new group or race of people that was being integrated was properly educated in a way that it suited and met their needs and economic status to raise it higher than what it was previously was. And as a result, you see a lot of issues today. And I'll give you a quick example. This idea that students need to be detained by police officers as this new curfew bill comes about. You get out of a child what you put into them. If you're going to treat them like a criminal, why wouldn't you expect that the violence and the crime rate is going to skyrocket, right? And so I would like for everybody, or I would caution everybody to think about how much we actually invest in our young folks, right? Because there's this notion that here inside of Baltimore and most black and brown communities, that the solution to the violence or the spike in disobedience that you see among young people is enforcement, or is police officers, is zero tolerance, right? And that is just a lie, you know, because the sad reality is that most young people would rather have a person sit down and talk with them than beat them up constantly, right? And that's speaking from a person who just graduated high school, right? And then, too, we also look at the dynamics of our educational system. A lot of people ask, why is education primarily only failing in indigenous districts, right? And it is partly because that we don't have the adequate resources. Too often our communities are underfunded, right, and other communities are overfunded. Too often we choose not to invest in certain things, but invest in more other things. The prison industrial complex itself is one big, business, and it's set up to profit off of folks. And that's stuff that we have to think about, that's stuff that we have to be cautious about, and that's stuff that we have to make an effort to say, hey, this is not what we stand for. We stand for something better, we stand for a greater legacy. Back in '64, during the civil rights time, there was a group of people known as SNCC, and they would say that they earned their insurgencies, right? That they was the ones, that wasn't inherited, that wasn't something that was just given to them, that they actually had to work for those insurgencies. How do we ensure that we are working for the same insurgencies that they stood for? How do we ensure that we are the ones teaching our communities? To be frank and honest with everyone here, I'm sure that most of us would agree that nobody knows the true extent of a problem better than a person that's having that problem. So it is a mistake for us to let people who aren't a part of our community, who don't really understand the issues that affect our community, to be the ones to try to be the problem solvers, right? That doesn't work. That doesn't work inside of our communities. And until we actually are able to come to that realization, to grasp that concept and say, hey, there are young people that are way more talented and smarter than what they're perceived to be, and so until we come to that realization and say, hey, there are folks inside the prison industrial complex that need a chance because they know, truthfully, what is the best route for them to take, right? Until we come to the understanding that, hey, we are the ones that should be on the front end of this thing and not saying, well, hey, you all go ahead on and do whatever you want with my taxpayer money, you know, or my time, my talents, when there are clearly folks that are inside of the community that could actually help address these issues. And even just leaving off with one quick thought, which is this idea or this reality that the people who are most directly affected by something should be on the front end and or the forefront of that. That's something that all of us would agree. Had it not been for you young people of color recognizing back in '64 that there was a need for them to be on the front end to say, hey, I stand for something and I'm not going to stand for this no longer, and I am the solution and not you. Had it not been for that, we probably would not have gotten as far as we did today. But because of that ideology and that mind mentality that has been lost somewhere along the way, because of this idea that we aren't educating our people fully, that we are teaching our children instead of showing them how to teach themselves, we are in this situation.
We're over
Yeah.
time. I have to let Angela Denise have a thought here, because all this has come from the community. I'm just curious, as someone in city government, how you hear what's been said here.
Thank you, Mark. And first, I'm going to begin with thanking the Real News for inviting me to be a part of the panel tonight. And I know one of the questions was, how can the Real News continue to be a part of the solution? And as I've listened to the panels tonight and listened to my fellow panelists, I think there are a lot more discussions and conversations that need to go forward. There is a lot of information that needs to be shared. There's a lot of data that needs to be shared. And there's a lot of truth-telling that needs to go forth. As Mark said, I am the director of the Mayor's Office on Criminal Justice. And I think within city government, we are quite a unique agency. We're one of the smaller city agencies, but we're tasked with being the ultimate collaborator in making Baltimore a safer, stronger, and healthier city. And just to add a little bit of context, I came to this position a year ago, and prior to that, I was the Juvenile Justice Director at Advocates for Children and Youth. And so I had an opportunity to work with my fellow panelists and some of the people in the room in that context. And my background is in juvenile justice and serving youth. So when we talk about, and I think the question initially was, what was missing from the school system? I want to change it to what we need more of from the school system. In our position with the Mayor's Office on Criminal Justice, we have the opportunity to work with our fellow city agencies, with the universities and colleges, with nonprofit organizations, with a full array of people. And I think most importantly, I have strived for our agency to work with impacted persons, because I feel like we cannot sit in City Hall and come up with ideas and say, this is what we need to do, but we need to hear from the people that are impacted by what we do. So as we talk about curfew, and we didn't talk about the Youth Connection Centers tonight, we've heard from the community. We've called on the community to be a part of our meetings. We've sat with youth about what do you need in the Youth Connection Centers, and those conversations are ongoing. And while I have the mic, I'll say, you can grab us. I have a colleague, Lakshana, here. We are looking for volunteers, and we want to hear from people about what is needed and how we can help our young people thrive and be prosperous. We're not about enforcing and having negative contacts with police officers. We're looking at ways to intervene. And when we see a young person who is in need, address that need, so that we're not talking down the road about, oh, we missed that opportunity to keep them from going into the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. And so just to sum up, in terms of what we can have more of in the school system, I think Natasha and Sabrina talked about the troubles and trauma that our students are coming to school with. They are witnessing people being killed, and they're seeing dead bodies on the street, and they're getting up and they're going to school the next morning. I don't know that teachers are trained to deal with that. So we do need to have trainings for our teachers, but we also need our school systems to be able to address that trauma so that we can help our young people heal, so that when they get into the classroom, they're in the position to learn. We also need to have more nonviolent conflict resolution. I know that there are programs in some of the city schools that focus on restorative justice, and we have community conferencing in some of the schools, and they see young people who may be on their way into the juvenile justice system, but they're able to intervene and heal neighborhoods, heal families, heal communities, and keep young people out of the juvenile justice system. We need more of those opportunities in our schools. And finally, and I know from my advocate seat, I've talked about school police and their role in school and how they contribute to the school to prison pipeline. On the flip side, I've also seen school police mentor and be engaged and involved in the students' lives that they interact with daily. That they are the counselors, the interveners, the mediators, that they deal with conflict and they help squash it, that they redirect people and young people away from the juvenile justice system. And so we need additional mentoring opportunities. In April, we had the opportunity to plan activities at City Hall for the National Youth Violence Prevention Week, and it was school police who brought 40 students from school to be a part of those activities. And the young people respect the police officers that they're interacting with, that they see them as adults who listen and want to know what is going on with them. And so just to sum up everything that we've said, I would focus on trauma, nonviolent conflict resolution, and mentoring opportunities. And so with that, we can dismantle the bridge between schools and the criminal justice system.
I want to thank the panel for being here this evening. And here at Real News, and we will turn this over to Jessica and Mike as we change panels, and they will do audience questions as the panels switch.